What you saw there on your screens, recent footage from Portland showing riots breaking out once again. You're in the war room. It is Monday, the 10th of August, the year of our Lord 2020. Vish Burra, Jack Maxey, Raheem Kassam broadcasting live here from Capitol Hill on the America's Voice Network, on the John Fredericks Radio Network, on Newsmax later in the day, and blown through the CCP's firewalls, subtitled in Mandarin by G News and GTV. Welcome all to the show. Got a great show lined up for you now, bringing on our guests, Jack Posobiec in this segment, Darren, Beattie, Liz, Yore, and more. Over now to Stephen K. Bannon.
Yeah, Raheem, we thought we'd start the show this morning in Hong Kong about the arrest of Jimmy Lai and 11 prominent dissidents, freedom fighters for democracy, or on Capitol Hill where the president, took our direction on Thursday and Friday and signed these EOs that jam up Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats. But because of the chaos in these urban areas over the weekend, we're going to start in places like Portland, Seattle, Chicago, New York City, in Missouri, where it looks like by defunding the police and backing off federal agents in this kind of lack of participation by the Department of Justice. That's what we're going to have Darren, Beattie from talking about the stories in Revolver last week. Where's DOJ? Where are the arrests? But I want to go to Posobiec first. Jack, we got this footage from people about what happened over the weekend. There's more footage coming in. You have from New York City to Chicago. You have a convergence too of just the basic violence and gang violence now with Antifa, and some of these cities are starting to implode. Walk us through your take on this, because you've been out in Seattle covering this and in Portland. Tell us what's going on.
Yeah, Steve, what we're really seeing now is a complete unraveling of the rule of law in these cities, and it's amounted to essentially a normalization of this type of activity. Americans are now suddenly getting used to seeing this play out night after night in major cities in the United States, major population centers like New York City, like Portland, like Seattle, where this violence has grown and grown. Chicago just last night, where this amount of violence has gone almost completely unchecked. When I say unchecked, I don't mean that there are individual police officers out there, but the amount of response that should be given to these in terms of National Guard deployments has just not been seen, because the political leaders have decided to essentially allow these mobs, these looters, and in many cases, political anarchists to run rampant in the streets. And then, of course, we're also seeing on the back end that DOJ is not going in and putting forward significant indictments and cases against the leaderships of these organizations. Now, we are seeing stuff on the front lines in terms of Operation Legend. You did see a major Chicago gang roll-up just last week. But at the same time, it really does feel like we need some sort of larger solution to this. And that's why you're starting to see, even all the way out in New York City, they just hit their 1,000th shooting victim. New York Post has the story of the year that's double for where they were in the past 2 years. People are moving out of the Upper West Side, Steve, which is not, it's known for, being one of the more stable, family-centered areas of New York City. It's not exactly known for its crime. People are moving out of the Upper West Side.
Here's what I do. I want the War Room posse, Raheem, Vish, Jack, with Posobiec, to go through the scale of this thing. I mean, you had the NYPD back down the other day from arresting a Black Lives Matter guy. They basically backed down after a couple hours standoff. You saw all the murders and shootings last night in New York, in Chicago, complete anarchy. You've got with looting and street violence in Seattle, in Portland, in Missouri. I mean, this is the scale of it, and the convergence of both the basic gun violence of the lawlessness from backing off the police and defund the police, coupled with Antifa and the radical elements of the Black Lives Matter, the Marxist, cultural Marxists of Black Lives Matter, are really in control. And, I thought President Trump, this whole thing in Portland was to have some sort of, and we didn't agree with it, but have some sort of ordered withdrawal of federal officers because the locals could take care of it. It looked like it was Fort Apache on Saturday night, right? And Sunday was almost as bad, but there doesn't seem to be any control of it. But guys, walk through the scale of this. This is so many cities, and it's a convergence of both street gun violence, gang violence, and now these anarchists with Antifa and the Marxist this underpinning of the Black Lives Matter movement.
Right, Steve, I wanna and ask Jack that question, and Jack Maxey, feel free to jump in here as well. We heard from President Trump that the compromise was being made a week and a half, 2 weeks ago now. Again, as you say, Steve, that the local police would be able to do this. They were bragging about it. The Democrats were bragging about it. Oh, we don't need President Trump's federal officers in there to help the situation out. We've got this. But it's very clear, Jack Posobiec, that they don't got this and that the situation is worsening once again. And, you know, you have to add in all of the other elements of this that are now coming into play. We'll talk about the 20,000 fake Chinese IDs that were found in Chicago this weekend, Customs Border Protection reporting that. We'll talk about what's being planned for Washington, D.C., the White House siege that Antifa and Black Lives Matter are planning between September and November the 3rd. But Jack, I want to ask you this question. Now, if you're President Trump, what is the situation as far as you're concerned? You've got this happening in Portland. You've got the malls being broken into and looted in Chicago. You've got New York at an all-time high once again. Should he and Bill Barr be coming out right now, putting those federal agents back on the streets and saying, you tried, you failed, we're going to have to take control of these streets?
Well, look, you know, all the way back in February, even before any of these riots started, I predicted that with these lockdowns and with the economic devastation and the destabilization of our cities, that we would see LA riot type events across the country. And unfortunately, that's come to pass. What the president has talked about doing and the White House is currently discussing and considering is if these governors refuse to mobilize their National Guard forces, and these are people who are trained in peacekeeping, they are trained in riot control, they are trained at taking care of these very specific types of situations very directly, that they are talking, if these governors don't do that, then the president has the ability to federalize those units and to call them up for the Oregon National Guard, the New York National Guard, at the Illinois National Guard. They would be able to do this for these major population centers to simply provide order. Now, it wouldn't need to be something long term. It would just really need to be something that's a show of force. Break it down from the actual peak of this, like we saw in Baltimore in 2015 when Barack Obama was president and the National Guard was called in to pacify the city of Baltimore after the Freddie Gray riots. So this is something that's been done many times in the past. I think there is a plan for it, and the president, if these governors aren't going to be able to do so, I think the president is really considering doing that.
Steve?
No, but we're going to have Beattie on here for a second of where the DOJ is. But you talk about that, Jack. But what's happened overnight? I mean, local authorities clearly can't handle this. Why is there not more movement today? And you were out there in Portland. In Portland, are we in the 75th day of that? Are we on the 75th day of this Antifa revolt where we pulled federal troops? I mean, after they've been there for 75 days, they think they're a permanent fixture. I mean, how are you going to dig them out? How are you going to dig them out now when they've got their hooks into the place?
Right. So the individuals out in Portland, and just to put it, I was in Seattle, but then I've been covering Portland as well. With 75 days since the drawdown, and it's not a complete abandonment, but a drawdown at the federal courthouse with Chad Wolf's forces that he brought in to augment. Now what they've done is they've changed tactics. They're now targeting the police officers' union hall, the PPA. They're going after that. They firebombed it the other night. They attempted to break in and commit arson. These guys know what they're doing. They know what they're about, and they're using distributed tactics in essentially an open source movement. You're now seeing closed black bloc activity. For 75 days, Steve, they've been able to develop a hardened cadre of a vanguard. If you read their literature in terms of what they talk about it, they've been able to develop units, medical systems, supply routes, legal support, their planning, mapping. That's why you're actually seeing now an advancement in their tactics. They're moving out to cover more ground to go after various other tactics. And it wouldn't surprise me if you would start to see actually multiple black blocs operating within one city at the same time with some degree of connectivity between them.
But let's bring in Liz Yore for a second. Liz is a former prosecutor for Chicago. We're going to have her on later in the show to talk about the Vatican, China, and the secret deal, all that. But she's a Chicago native and highlighted to me last night, this morning, what's going on. Liz, walk us through what actually happened in the city last night, because the press reports, I don't think, fully grasp the scale of the chaos and anarchy in Chicago overnight.
Well, Steve, this was all over social media at 9 o'clock last night. So they got a heads up. The mayor supposedly called in 400 additional Chicago police officers, but they were overwhelmed. You know, Michigan Avenue, the Magnificent Mile, is the crown jewel of Chicago, and they hit it big. They hit Nordstrom's, they attacked and looted Macy's, jewelry stores, ATMs, the water tower place. It was organized, and frankly, the cops were overwhelmed. What they did was the city lifted the bridges, closed off all the major highways coming into Chicago, the feeder highways. Lakeshore Drive, another jewel of Chicago, was closed down. This morning, people are reporting being terrified walking to work. There's indications that the looting is still going on, but has ramped down significantly. They're going into northern areas, Old Town areas, going south to Roosevelt Road. This is what people need to understand. The major cities are the economic engine of the states. These major cities are being shut down. Their economic base is being eroded. And what is happening is that Antifa is marching eastward to the favorable big cities that have complying and weak mayors who are afraid to get tough with them. Steve, I've been saying for a month, the federal government needs to start charging 18 U.S.C. 2101, crossing state lines to incite a riot. We know when they interview these guys that they're coming from out of state. That's where there's a federal jurisdictional issue that they need to start prosecuting. And we've got to stop using the words federal troops. Federal agents and federal law enforcement need to be brought in to supplement Chicago police departments and the National Guard. There's indications National Guard, the Illinois Guard, has not been called in. So this is the example of where you have weak state's attorneys who've been put into office by George Soros, weak mayors. The city is overwhelmed at this point, attacking the most prosperous.
Liz, we
want you to hang on for the next segment.
Yeah, just hang on for us. We've got a break in 40 seconds here. Steve, anything further before we break?
Look, it's tough. I'm the chairman of the Rule of Law Society. It's for China, and you see what happened in Hong Kong, where they snatched the leaders last night with no rule of law, this national security, and then you see the anarchy and chaos in the streets of America. Somebody's got to step up to the plate. Next segment, we'll have Darren, Beattie, Liz Yore, Jack Posobiec will join us back in a little while, talk about anarchy and chaos in the big cities of America.
And the whole team returns. Hashtag War and Pandemic to have your say on Parler, on Twitter. We'll be right back after this short break.
War Room Pandemic with Stephen K. Bannon.
The epidemic is a demon, and we cannot let this demon hide.
War Room Pandemic. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
Well, 2020 has been a gut punch for American business, and if you're going to succeed, you need every possible advantage. NetSuite by Oracle is what smart companies are run on. The world's #1 cloud business system, a sponsor of this show. You can get your free guide right now at netsuite.com/Bannon. Welcome back to the War Room.
Guys, I have a little piece of information, not exactly breaking news, but it is illustrative of the problem that we have, and I know Steve's got some very strong opinions on this.
Just hit us with the news.
Ken Cuccinelli was at a law enforcement appreciation picnic yesterday in Virginia, and he had some strong words that we don't see getting backed up in the street. He said, there are peaceful protesters. We all want to protect them. There are rioters and criminals. Frankly, we'd all like to arrest them. But among them are the ones that are targeting law enforcement to put fear in the heart of law enforcement and to try and compel us to make policy changes through violence. We have a word for that in the English language, and that word is terrorism. Steve, back to you.
Look, I love me some Ken Cuccinelli. He's a fantastic guy. I think he's done a really solid job over at DHS. I think there are greater things in his future. However, I'd rather not hear that eating a cold drumstick at some picnic in rural Virginia. I'd like to have him out in Chicago or in Portland, throwing down on these criminals and throwing down terrorists. Where is Antifa? This is Ken didn't know Antifa, a month ago on TV, didn't know Antifa was an international organization. Why is Antifa not been declared a terrorist organization? Why are we not going after the financing? Why are we not using the full powers of the federal government, the Department of Justice, to go after this? This is ridiculous.
Yep.
This is embarrassing. How can we stand up to the rest of the world? How can we stand up to the Chinese Communist Party and talk about the rule of law when our streets are lawless and we've got elected officials that are exacerbating the problem in these big cities? This is why it's incumbent upon the DOJ, the White House, to get on top of this. I want to go back to Liz Yore and ask you that question before I bring in Darren Beattie for a moment. Liz, I want to go back to this thing about interstate lines. We've talked about this now for months when this first started. I think it was Steve Cortez or somebody about Chicago, about people crossing interstate lines to cause this havoc. How come this has not been done yet? How come there's been no push in your mind as a prosecutor? And do you see anybody in either DOJ or even the Attorney General office in Illinois or the city prosecutor, is any law enforcement at all backing up the police and trying to make some mass arrests here?
No, Steve, I don't. Full disclosure, I have never said this publicly. My father was the prosecutor of the Chicago 7. I had a ringside seat of the riots in Chicago in 1968. He charged the 8 defendants with crossing state lines to incite a riot. There should be assistant U.S. attorneys on the street every night looking at what's happening. There should be war rooms in every United States attorney's office working together with local law enforcement. Look, I know that prosecuting under the federal government is the one thing that is going to stop this madness and this violence. But it's going to take guys with guts, tough prosecutors, to get in there and charge, keep these guys behind jail, find who's funding these terrorists, and start prosecuting. We cannot just talk about it or let the state, it's a recycle. They come in one door and out the next door in 12 hours, and they're back on the street throwing Molotov cocktails. The federal government has to lead the way. And I'll tell you, the people are expecting and understand that it's the federal government that is going to have to restore order on the streets. We talk about these task force, the federal, state, and local law enforcement will start using these task force to bring order back into the streets and charge these guys under federal laws, get them behind bars for the rest of their lives. Everybody is backing off and being afraid. I saw this firsthand. I know what it takes to bring order in the street. It is cops and it's prosecutors working together and then charging them. This is going to continue unless we have some tough prosecutors stepping up like they did in the late 1960s.
Liz, hang on for 1 second. I want to bring in Darren Beattie. Darren, I told you came on the show, I think a couple of weeks ago, about Revolver had this story about DOJ. And remember, we're huge Bill Barr fans. What Bill Barr's done in putting the Chinese Communist Party on notice has been extraordinary. He's been, I think, a terrific attorney general. It was the reason I was so shocked when I read that article and actually reached out to you and said, hey, have you seen this thing? Can you help me interpret it? Walk us through what Revolver said, I think it was 2 weeks ago, about what's the problem at DOJ and why is there not more activity? Why are they not the tip of the spear, like Liz said, in organizing this and starting to put guys, starting to arrest people, starting to panel grand juries, starting to put the bad guys in jail? What's the problem?
Well, that's a great question. And all of this discussion about Cuccinelli, ultimately the question is, who's at the top? Who's making the calls? And the Revolver news story that you referred to suggests with multiple sources that Barr is actually a little bit scared to take the aggressive action required, which would, as your previous guest noted, involve serious prosecutions. And there could be a number of reasons for that. It could be an issue of institutional insurrection. As we know, the DOJ is a kind of swamp stronghold, and there could be a lot of resistance to any strong action taken on the part of Barr. Nonetheless, what we need right now is not complaining about what the left is doing, not complaining about what Antifa is doing, but taking a very serious, critical look at what people on our side need to be doing right now.
Let me ask you, Bill Barr has been a warrior, and we've been a huge, we're huge Barr fans, particularly about what he's done against the Chinese Communist Party and other things that he's worked on very, very heavily. How can he possibly be intimidated? Walk people through. What do you mean there's a insurrection potentially in the Justice Department and resistance to actually doing what Liz Yore says is getting U.S. attorneys, assistant U.S. attorneys on the street in situations like last night in Chicago, working with police, working with federal law enforcement to actually start prosecuting people? What do you mean there's an insurrection?
Well, look, I mean, in order to take strong action, such as we're calling for, you need institutional buy-in on the lower rungs. We know that, FBI is not fully on board with the president's agenda and such. In fact, Revolver had another exclusive showing a bunch of FBI agents literally taking a knee for violent Black Lives Matter protesters. And so I could imagine Barr might have a fear that if he were to go out on a limb and take serious action here, you would have aggressive coordinated leaks and all types of efforts on the lower levels to sabotage the effort, make him look bad, and then possibly have him out to dry. So, I mean, that suggests that ultimately the real leadership needs to come from even higher than him if we're going to expect any action such as what's required.
Darren, hang on one second. We'll run out of time. I want to bring Liz Yore back in. Liz, does that make sense to you? Is that why you think you see this lack? And it's across the country. You don't see it in Portland. You don't see it in Seattle. You don't see it in Chicago, New York City. You don't see really an engagement, it looks like, by the U.S. attorneys to take the lead here. Is what Darren Beattie's and what the guys at Revolver are saying, do you think this could be correct, that the Justice Department itself, people in the Justice Department, don't want to be aggressive here?
Yeah, I think that may be true. All you need are a few U.S. attorneys who have the guts. And I would suggest, when I was working child exploitation cases and the FBI wasn't cooperating with me, other law enforcement agencies like ICE, Homeland Security, they stepped up and they have the ability to do the same kind of investigation, testify before the federal grand jury. You go where you have the support. And so, if the FBI is not in on it, you find the U.S. attorney. There's got to be U.S. attorneys around this country that are willing to investigate and prosecute these cases. Get together, you're brave, you're few, you're bold, and start prosecuting. And stop. I agree, the FBI may not be all in, but we've got to be martyrs for our country, right? We've got to step into the
Liz,
2 minutes,
Liz,
Steve.
when you talk about the FBI, we just stood down ICE, and we just stood down Customs and Border, and we just stood down other federal agents related to DHS in Portland. They were the target of this, and our belief on the show was that you couldn't back those guys down because it was going to be a big victory for the Antifa terrorists. So how do you say that go? Do you believe that DHS has been fully emboldened here to take dramatic action?
I think they're the troops. I think they're terrific. I think those guys didn't want to leave. I know for a fact that they're willing to restore law and order. It probably has to come from the very top, from the president. The people are begging for their cities to be restored to peace and order. You find the men and women who are willing to do that. You build together war rooms in every state so that you can prosecute these guys and gather much needed intelligence, share that intelligence, and start, restoring. It's not going to happen overnight, but
Yep.
You've got to organize and have a sense of this is our mission. The primary purpose of law enforcement is the safety of the citizenry.
Yeah, Steve.
And
Yeah.
at this
Can
point,
we-
Liz?
Liz, hang on. Can we ask we want all three of you guys to stay on for the next segment. Please stick with us. Raheem?
Yeah, please stick with us, guys. We've still got more to cover here. Got more questions for all of the team. From Jack Maxey, Vish Bora, Jack Posobiec, Liz Yore, Darren Beattie, Stephen K. Bannon, Raheem Kassam. You got a packed house here for hashtag War Room Pandemic, and we're live following your comments in the live stream on Facebook, on Twitter, on Parler, on YouTube. Make sure you're getting stuck in and sharing. Hashtag War Room Pandemic returns in just a moment.
War Room Pandemic with Stephen K. Bannon.
The epidemic is a demon, and we cannot let this demon hide.
War Room Pandemic. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
Well, in turbulent times, you need every possible advantage, and one of those is NetSuite by Oracle, a sponsor of this show and the world's #1 cloud business system. Smart companies run on NetSuite because NetSuite gives you the visibility and control over your financials, your HR, your inventory, your e-commerce, and more. Everything you need all in one place. Whether you're doing 1 million or hundreds of millions in sales, NetSuite lets you manage every penny with precision. With NetSuite, you have the agility to compete with anyone, work from anywhere, run your whole company right from your phone. So join over 20,000 companies who trust NetSuite to make it happen. NetSuite surveyed hundreds of business leaders and assembled a playbook of the top strategies they're using as America reopens for business. So get your free guide. 7 actions businesses need to take now, and schedule your free product tour at netsuite.com/Bannon. That's a free guide and free product tour right now at netsuite.com/Bannon. Welcome back to the War Room. Got a packed out War Room here this morning. I'm going to throw it over to Steve right now. Steve?
Breaking news that came out of Chicago you want to update us on?
Yeah, it just sort of shows you the ridiculous nature of their enforcement in Chicago, Steve. They had Mayor Lori Lightfoot actually personally went and intervened at a beach party that was going on Montrose Beach. She writes in Twitter, "It's called a pandemic, people. This reckless behavior on Montrose Beach is what will cause us to shut down the parks and lakefronts. Don't make us take steps backwards." Then she further gets lauded by Pritzker, who says that it's a demonstration of what we've seen in the numbers, which is that young people are not taking this seriously. And unfortunately, we see that the numbers of young people contracting COVID-19 are going up. He praised Lori Lightfoot for taking action and breaking up the beach party while the city burns. Steve, back to you.
These are two. The governor and the mayor are AWOL during this crisis in Chicago. Want to go back to Darren Beattie for a moment. Darren, Antifa. Liz talked about RICO. She talked about crossing interstate borders. Isn't Antifa got all the characteristics of what Cuccinelli says is a terrorist organization? Why have they not been designated by the White House and by this administration as a terrorist organization?
That's a great question. They certainly bear all the markers of a terrorist organization. And in fact, I believe the president did tweet his intention to so designate Antifa as a terrorist organization. So unfortunately, that tweet seems to have fallen by the wayside of excellent tweets like the birthright citizenship tweet that seem to never find a way into successful implementation. So hopefully they will follow up on that. I do think the institutional issue that I raised earlier is quite relevant here. I would go out on a limb to say, perhaps provocatively, that there are many elements within our bureaucratic apparatus of the executive powers that are at least in sympathy with Antifa. In fact, I might even characterize Antifa not simply as a terrorist group, but as a quasi-paramilitary force for certain elements of the American ruling class. And that, I think, complicates the issue. And it's quite disturbing to see the parallelism between how Antifa and Black Lives Matter function and how, for instance, color revolutions function overseas. I think there are parallels that have deeply disturbing suggestions and that might gesture toward why it's been difficult to actually designate this as a terrorist group from within the United States government.
Okay, hang on one second. We got Liz Yore and we got Jack Posobiec, two experts. I want to go back to Darren Beattie. You said you believe that Antifa has characteristics of a paramilitary operation of certain segments of America's ruling elites. That is explosive. You're one of the smartest guys I know, so please unpack that for a second for our audience. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, they claim to be this kind of brave left-wing revolutionary force attacking power structures when, in fact, every single powerful institution in the country, including all of the major corporations and tech firms, have expressed support for the rhetoric associated with these riots. So the notion that they're actually challenging the power structure in this country rather than serving as a kind of shock troop, as a warning to the American deplorables as to what's coming if they don't step in line, I think that's kind of more what's going on here and speaks to the reason as to why you're not having any serious prosecutions. Again, it's just like when you see certain fake protests going on overseas and you wonder who's behind this. There's a force behind this. I think there's a similar dynamic here in the United States that at least partially accounts for some of the disturbing inaction that we've so pointedly identified.
I want to bring in Jack Posobiec for a second. Jack, you've actually been out there behind the lines. You were in embed in this kind of undercover out, and I believe it was in Seattle in the Chaz at that time. Is Darren Beattie right? Is this really more of a paramilitary operation, fairly well coordinated with different elements of it, and you think working as the running dogs of certain elements of the American power structure?
Well, Steve, let's talk about Seattle for a little bit, because it was actually in Seattle in 1999 when the first wide-scale black bloc hit sort of the national scene. But what was that black bloc protesting? It was protesting the WTO. It was protesting globalization. And at that point, that was actually when China was brought into the WTO. Throughout the early 2000s, you saw black bloc protests and anarchist actions against the G8. You saw actions taken against globalization, offshoring, outsourcing, and even the European Union. I'm sure Raheem Kassam could talk about that. However, all of a sudden, since Occupy Wall Street, Zuccotti Park 2011, when that spread, now you're seeing a complete switch. And instead of protesting the power structure, they actually seem to be shoring up that same power structure that they once protested.
Do we still have Steve?
Yeah, did we lose Posobiec?
No, I think there may have been some communication problems between the two of you guys Skyping in here. But Jack did mention something that I wanted to pick up on really quickly, and that's the international element to all of this. Steve, you mentioned in the last segment that Cuccinelli didn't know that Antifa was an international organization, that it had its roots internationally, that it had cells internationally, that it operates internationally, that it works hand in hand internationally across all of its different forms and entities all over the Western world. The other thing that we're missing here to all of this is the same thing that we were missing originally, the same thing the Trump administration was missing when having such problems going after TikTok and WeChat, is looking at precedent internationally to tackle Antifa. If you go through some of the German states' reports in the last couple of years about far left terrorism, you will find very clear evidence of Antifa terror activity, and as Darren Beattie mentioned, also just talking about the paramilitary element of all of this, not just at its history, not just at its roots, but today. And that's what the Trump administration should be doing. The TikTok and WeChat executive orders that the president released last week leaned heavily on what India had done and the reports coming out of India on China and tech. What they need to do is go through the reports coming out of Europe, the European Union, and Germany into Antifa and their paramilitary status and the hard left terrorism that you see day in and day out there, and use that in the executive order to prescribe Antifa as a terrorist organization, Steve.
Darren Beattie, is what Raheem's laying out, is that the case that you're making, that this is actually an international terrorist organization and used as a paramilitary operation here in the United States?
Well, yeah, it certainly operates internationally, and people who are politically active in Europe might be more kind of intimately familiar with the kind of hard-nosed operations of the Antifa groups that have come to our shores with a kind of vengeance. I think it would be great to designate them as a terrorist group, but I think the disturbing connections between Antifa and the government structure itself, at least in terms of sympathies, indicate that there are pretty severe bottlenecks to anything seriously being done. And actually, what I almost anticipate is something like, leading up to the election, the left will turn off the spigot. It's as a message, like a mafia message. It's a nice cities you've got there. It would be a shame if this happened again. We can turn it off. Trump can't turn it off. We can turn it off. And I think they will send that message leading up to the election, indicating that this is not just some kind of chaotic, amorphous structure. This is quite controlled. It's controlled for a purpose, and it's deeply connected with certain elements of the American ruling class, and has a presence within the government itself.
Darren, thank you very much for joining us. Very insightful. I want to turn back to Liz Yore. We got a couple minutes in this segment. Mark me on the time, Raheem.
Yep.
Liz, to get serious and get tough about this, if we're Darren Beattie saying, hey, there's guys in the Justice Department, even institutionally, don't want to do this. You mentioned war rooms at the local level. Would a war room be driven by the U.S. attorneys? Put us in the room. Who's in there and what are they doing? And how important is DOJ in leading that effort?
Yes, the U.S. Attorney's Office would run it like they do in major drug cases, in pedophilia cases. They work with local law enforcement, and they share information. No more spigots, no more silos. They're sharing their information. They also have to start charging the funding sources. Right now, Antifa and Black Lives Matter are, chic, cool. That's got to stop. And once you start charging and following the money, it becomes no longer cool for the big corporations and the big law firms to fund these terrorist groups. So, first of all, label them as terrorist groups. Secondly, follow the money. Thirdly, charge them under federal and state law and be creative and tough. And also, whether it's a conspiracy case, they know where the money's coming from. I certainly hope the federal government does. If they're spending so much time in their intelligence chasing hoax Russian theories, they better stop and start looking at Antifa. But I'm convinced that there are local law enforcement and federal authorities who have a sense of how this structure is built. There's a lot more work that has to be done. They've got to do this and coordinate across the United States, because then they will be able to anticipate what's the next big city that they're going to hit.
1 minute, guys.
Now, another word about Occupy Wall Street. It was many of the people who were supporting it, Jeff Sachs, Joe Stiglitz, Naomi Klein, a year or 2 years later are showing up at the Vatican and pushing the Vatican's agenda with China and the Vatican's agenda with climate change. So they are linked. And they're linked in the world order of pushing the elite agenda by creating chaos and terrorizing the deplorables. So we need law enforcement to be brave and step up.
Liz, we're going to get you back on later to talk about the Vatican. I want to thank you very much for giving us an update in Chicago. Raheem, back to you. I'd love Jack Posobiec to stay over. Got a question to him in the next segment.
Yeah, Jack, if you could stay over, that would be fantastic. Thanks to all the guests in the first part of the show today. When we come back, more of Stephen K. Bannon, Vish Burra, Jack Maxey, Raheem Kassam, Natalie Winters joins us in studio as well. Hashtag War Room Pandemic returns with more from you guys in the chat after this break.
War Room Pandemic with Stephen K. Bannon.
The epidemic is a demon, and we cannot let this demon hide.
War Room Pandemic. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
Okay, welcome back to the War Room, broadcasting live from Capitol Hill. I'm Raheem Kassam, Jack Maxey by my side. Got Natalie Winters joining us in the next hour. Vish Bora, Jack Posobiec, Stephen K. Bannon. Jack, we wanted to keep you on because there's a whole lot to get to here as well. But one of the things that I wanted to ask you first and foremost, and I want to throw it over to Steve and get your thoughts on all the rest and from the Chaz and so forth. But I wanted to ask you about this siege. I mentioned this siege in the first couple of blocks of the show. I realized after I mentioned it that people wouldn't necessarily know what I'm talking about, because I then went and looked at it on social media. There's not a whole lot out there about it. Certainly no articles have been written about it, but I'm sure you can expect one at the National Pulse later on today. Jack, what is this White House siege that is being planned? Who is behind it? Is this a real thing, or is just some Twitter accounts making empty threats?
Yeah, well, Raheem, what we saw yesterday on Twitter was an account called Adbusters. And for those who may not have been around 2011, remember the Occupy Wall Street movement, which was really the first large-scale anarchist protest over the past 10 years. This Adbusters organization is actually the organization that was behind the original Occupy Wall Street, New York City, Zuccotti Park. They've specifically now called for a siege to begin of the White House in Washington, D.C., to begin on September 17th. Now, why is September 17th a significant date? That is the exact anniversary. It's going to be the 9th anniversary of the start of Occupy Wall Street in Zuccotti Park 2011. So they're going back on the same day. They're calling for it to last for 50 days. That means through September, through October, and through the election itself. So they are taking this all the way forward to the White House, and I predict that we're going to see, just like we saw in the original Occupy Wall Street movement, more occupations that take place around the city, as this gives essentially inspiration to other copycats to be able to do the same. It's really calling in some of the big guns in terms of this. It is a decentralized open source movement, anarchists and the Antifa. However, having somebody, a huge name like this, Adbusters, come back into the mix now, this is huge, and it really shouldn't be overlooked.
Steve?
This is huge, Raheem, because Andrew Breitbart's last great work before he passed away, in fact, he died in the middle of us filming a movie called Occupy Wall Street, or Occupy Unmasked. It was about the movement. Andrew Breitbart ripped the mask off of them, that these were just kids, flower children that were upset about the financial crisis of 2008, and really got down to the radical elements of it. He drilled down, and I got to tell you, Adbusters drove that entire, and that was a group of hardcore, leftists, a lot of entrepreneurs who had made money, but there were serious people in back of that, and that's why that movement is really a forerunner to this. So this siege is something you just can't dismiss. Let's go back to last night, Raheem. Liz Yore told us it was social media that got this rolling about organizing this at 9 o'clock. That's why in the next hour we're going to talk about tech and China and the CCP and all of that. This is being organized at a very serious level. These are just not kids out there that are protesting Mr. Floyd's murder in Minneapolis. This is an organized global effort. And hey, remember, we don't believe in conspiracies whatsoever, but there are no coincidences. That's why this thing is well organized, and it's building momentum. And at the top level, this has to be dealt with now. You can't kick the can down the road. This is not about tweets. This is about action, action, action. Jack, put us in the middle. You're out there in the Chaz. What type of action, both from law enforcement and from prosecutors, work against these people?
Well, Steve, you need twofold types of action, twofold, I should say. From a perspective of the streets, what you really do need is a serious martial presence. And when I say martial presence, I don't necessarily mean, tanks rolling down the streets like Tiananmen Square. Of course, that's not who we are. We need law enforcement that's able to protect themselves, that's able to carry out their job safely, but also to make sure that lawlessness and anarchy do not break out. In Seattle, at the East Precinct, what I saw, They attempted to do that. The mayor stood down, abandoned the precinct, and that led to the creation of the Chaz. Those days, that month of June, back in June of 2020, that led to lawlessness. It led to shootings, led to opportunists, gang violence coming into there, complete usurpation of the rule of law and the foundations of our republic itself. And then, well, on the next level, the fact that you still, at this point, have not seen any serious prosecutions come out of Chaz, when we know there's at least 2 murders that took place in there. This is really shocking, and that's why if you go back and look at Seattle just last night, the same groups are actually active again. They're looking to retake that territory. They want to take it back to tell the people of Seattle that this is their city. And what's the city council doing out in Seattle? They're not fighting back against them. Just yesterday, they decided that they were going to cut the city police chief, Carmen Best, her salary by $100,000. Now, she's going to be being paid $100,000 less than her white predecessor. I guess that's institutional racism.
Steve, you've got about a minute and a half here.
Jack, I want to thank you. Yeah, Jack, I want to thank you for taking time away today to join us. Your reporting has been fantastic. In fact, you've been attacked by those people in Washington, D.C. So just want to tell you, next time you do that, make sure you've got security and you're well protected, because you're too valuable an asset to people looking for freedom and law and order to be messed with. So thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thanks, Steve.
I'll go with him, Steve.
That's yeah. I'll send Vish. Guys, I gotta tell you, we're going to start this show today. We're going to talk about the tremendous town hall we had over the weekend on hydroxy that Jack Maxey and the team had. We were going to talk about Hong Kong, the Chinese Communist Party, technology, the debates on the Hill. But this shows you what's really going on in the country. And we talked about this weeks ago. Where's the Justice Department? We're huge fans of Bill Barr. He's been a tremendous, tremendous attorney general. On this one, he's got to step up to the plate. We got to start seeing some arrests. We got to start seeing the prosecutorial side of law enforcement. Guys, back to you. I know we got a big hour. I think we're going to try to have Mark Simon on about he got indicted in Hong Kong over the weekend. As Jimmy Life's partner, we're going to try to get him on at the bottom of the hour. We got Liz Yore and Natalie Winters joining us next hour.
Well, of course, the good news is, despite having to change it up and get to all this other stuff in the first hour, we've got a lot more time left, ladies and gentlemen, so make sure you're staying tuned. War Room Pandemic returns with Raheem Kassam, Stephen K. Bannon, Jack Maxey, Natalie Winters, Vish Bora. Just a moment.